Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. Hey, in this video, I'd like to talk about a paper, some original research I presented at the annual conference of the American Society of Engineering Managers. It was held this year, 2018, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And the topic was Asian American engineers and motivation to lead. Now, before I go into the detail, let me just maybe address some of the obvious. What I've noticed is people get very uncomfortable when I mention that title. I was at work and I was in a staff meeting and mentioned I'll be presenting a paper on it, and there was kind of this uncomfortable feeling like, are you like prejudiced, or you're not supposed to talk about that and stuff. And so just to put your mind at ease, the overarching idea was, I think I've identified some prejudice, and the point of this paper is to deflate the prejudice. So it's not that I'm advocating being prejudiced. I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to work for social justice. So take a breath, pull up your chair, and let's talk about this topic. All right. So any rate, so the paper's name was Motivation to Lead in Asian American Engineering Managers, and as I mentioned, I'm Tom Ulrich. All right, so what I did in this paper, or in the presentation, what I want to do is let me give you some backstory to kind of understand how this started. Let's do the traditional literature review. I'll talk about Asian American engineers, what we know in the research. We'll talk about motivation to lead, and I'm going to talk about an aspect of societal culture called individualism and collectivism. I'll talk about my methodology, I'll show you my results, and then I'll discuss some of my conclusions. All right, so here's the backstory. So I've been at Tandem Diabetes Care for about 12 years, and I'm one of the original employees of everybody at Tandem. I don't know how many there are, 800 or so. There's only one person who's been there longer than me, and it's a guy who, when I joined, was a 21-year-old intern at his first job. I'm proud to announce he has my old job as Director of Software Engineering. At any rate, so I've been there from the beginning. I've been on there the whole time in this incredible journey of, there was four of us just sort of goofing around after work, and now we're, we have a market cap of over $2 billion, and, we're this very successful manufacturer. So it's been kind of a crazy ride. At any rate, probably about 8 years ago, I was in a staff meeting, and I was, back then we were still pretty small, but I was talking about the future, and I pretty correctly called it, it wasn't all that hard to do, that, we're going to grow and we're going to need multiple engineering managers. And so kind of from the beginning, I was thinking about who to develop as a manager, and I identified 5 of the engineers that I said, I think these are going to be the people that'll be running the department in, say, 10 years. And indeed, those 5 are, in fact, the managers, and 3 of the 5 are Asian American. And I didn't particularly think about that fact. I just sort of, mentioned it. And one of my coworkers, who fortunately is not at Tandem anymore, he looked at me and said, well, why did you pick those 3? Don't you know that Asians don't like to lead? Now, I was so shocked by this statement that I think all I managed to say was, what? If that had happened today, I think I might have looked at him and say something like, so who do you imagine is running China? So, and that kind of set the stage of, it planted something in my head. It's like there's a certain amount of people that seem to believe that, Asians don't like to lead. And I was working on my PhD. I just finished this last summer, 2018. And I about 4 years ago came across some literature and found that there's a disproportionately small number of Asian American engineers in leadership roles, 25%, as opposed to European American engineers. By the way, I'm using this terminology, European American engineer. I really want to focus the conversation on engineers working in America, and people who are culturally American, culturally Asian, and I'm trying to exclude, say, for instance, someone who's maybe born and raised in Germany and recently come here or something. At any rate, so I came across that surprising statistic, And then about 3 years ago, there was a requirement for basically a class project. Hey, you got to do some original research and write this up and so on, a major project. And what I decided to do was to look at this issue because I had come across some other research, some recent research on motivation to lead, and I thought, oh well, that seems to be pretty relevant. And anyway, so I did this paper. And then about a year ago, when it was time to submit papers to ASEM, I was kind of having some angst over, I have a fairly small sample size, and I thought, well, should I present this or not? I obviously decided to, and I'll show you. I'll give you the statistical justification why I think I still found something significant. And just to clarify things, this research was not part of my dissertation. This was basically a homework assignment. I mean, a major project, but still, that's what it was. At any rate, so getting to the literature, what do we know about Asian American engineers? A lot of this research started with Tang in 1993, and apparently there's something called a Survey of Natural and Social Scientists and Engineers. It's something the U.S. government funds, where people take surveys, and in 1986, they had well over 10,000 engineers, and 10,800 of them were European American engineers, and the data indicated that 40% of them had some kind of leadership role. And in the same data set, there was 1,300 Asian American engineers, and it indicated only 25% had some sort of a leadership role. So, okay, so that's interesting. What happened then is there's also a lot of papers where basically they argue that Asian Americans generally outperform European Americans in high school, college, and grad school. And, it's actually really kind of uncomfortable reading some of these papers. They make most of the research is done by researchers who are themselves Asian, and they kind of make some very extreme statements, but, they make the same, that nonetheless, they have the numbers and put together the data that, it seems to be true. And that's really an interesting fact then, is we know that the Asian American engineering students outperform their European American counterparts at pretty much every level of school, and yet the level or the percentages of Asian Americans in leadership is so skewed in the opposite direction. So that's kind of the quandary that fueled this research. Tang called the phenomena here, he called it the broken ladder, so it's sort of a different metaphor, kind of along the lines of glass ceilings, a broken ladder. And there's actually been a number of researchers who have proposed some explanations. Tsai, out there at the University of California, Riverside, in 2010, he suggested, he did some research and kind of found the same thing. And one of his ideas was, maybe it's because the two groups conceive of leadership differently. And I think there might be some truth to that. The thing that gets a little bit confusing in my mind is if you were talking about Asians living in Asia versus Americans living in America, I totally get that the two groups conceive of leadership differently. Once you start talking about the phenomena of second generation, third generation, in this context, Asians, it gets a little bit harder to know exactly how to think about that. Zinn in 1997 thought that maybe the difference was, impression management, sort of, the maybe skewing the selection factor. Zinn also simply said, many Asian Americans simply don't want to be leaders. However, Zinn also did say that, well, okay, I know I just said that, but I think the example Zinn used was, if you look at Toyota and Fuji Heavy Industries and Nissan and all those, they do seem to be run by Asians. So the idea that Asians don't like to lead doesn't seem to wash. But then Zinn would say, well, okay, but Asian Americans are the ones that don't want to lead. Now, an important thing here is this research I just showed you, most of it was done prior to Chan and Drasgow, which I'll talk about in a second. And what Chan and Drasgow did, well, I guess I'll talk about it now, is basically they introduced this concept of motivation to lead, and they developed a scale for measuring that. So the kind of the idea of the paper was, oh, okay, well, let's revisit it, measure it, and see what we can find. At any rate, what Chan and Drasgow did, it really was Chan's PhD dissertation he did while he was, I think he was a student at University of Illinois, and his advisor was Fritz Drasgow. And their research was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, so that is a top-tier journal. It was a quantitative study. They had an enormous sample size. They had 2,100 participants in 3 distinct groups. They had almost 1,600 Singaporean soldiers. They had about 270 Singaporean community college students, and they had 288 participants at a large Midwestern U.S. university, presumably the University of Illinois, although it doesn't say that. At any rate, so when you look at these numbers, in comparison, you say, well, that 288 is small compared to the 1591. However, I will observe that an n equals 288 is a pretty darn good data set. I mean, that's a lot of data. At any rate, so what he did, what Chan and Drasgow did, is they did the thing where they did a big survey of the literature. They came up with a number of questions, and they used factor analysis to sort of narrow down the questions. And ultimately, what they came up with was an instrument that had 27 questions, 3 sets of 9 questions, and they proposed 3 types of motivation to lead. So the first one is called affective identity motivation to lead. Affect is like an umbrella term. It means like mood and emotion and all that touchy-feely stuff. And identity, well, you know what that is. That's sort of how you see yourself. And so the idea of affective identity motivation to lead is kind of like you want to lead because you like the idea of being a leader, you see yourself as a leader, and it's just sort of a very natural thing for you. Now, social normative motivation to lead is a little bit different. Now, normative, if you're not familiar with that technical term, that means like sort of like moral responsibility. So the idea is you feel either like a social responsibility, like you owe it to your friends, you owe it to your family, or like a moral obligation or something like that. But there's sort of, as opposed to affective identity is wanting to be a leader because you like the idea. Social normative is, when you want to be a leader because you feel like you have to. And then the third one is, and he words this kind of oppositely. He calls it non-calculative, and I think the reason is that way a high score on all 3 is kind of a good thing. But let me explain what a calculative motivation to lead would be. So a calculative motivation to lead is you're kind of in it for yourself. You want to lead because you want the money, you want the girls, you want whatever, the status, the car, whatever. So non-calculative motivation to lead is sort of this transcending that stuff and kind of for a pure and idealistic reasons, just good of society. At any rate, so what he did then was they did. Actually, Chan did the work. What Chan did was he had these 3 motivations to lead. And he had some antecedents. He found personality was an antecedent. But he also found a couple issues of culture and what's called vertical individualism, horizontal individualism, and collectivism. And let's see. So what the deal is, these terms, collectivism and individualism, comes from Trandis and Gelfand. If you're familiar with Project Globe, these guys were key figures. Harry Trandis wrote the introduction or the preface or whatever to the Project Globe, and he mentored a lot of the people that were key figures in the project. Michelle Gelfand was one. I think she wrote a couple of one of the chapters. I think it might have even been the collectivism one. At any rate, what Trandis and Gelfand's idea is they thought there was 4 dimensions related to collectivism. And a lot of people would sort of naturally assume that individualism and collectivism were sort of 2 ends of the same scale. And what they argue, what their data showed, was that wasn't actually true, that you can be, they're sort of orthogonal. And also they found that there was vertical and horizontal components. So you know, it's what that means. Horizontal refers to sort of individualism relative to your peers, and vertical refers to individualism or collectivism, sort of relative to your parents or supervisors or something like that. Any rate, so here's just to sort of further explain what this is. Here's some of the sample questions they had in their surveys. You know, I feel good when I cooperate with others. Okay, that's horizontal collectivism. So the, you know, cooperating with others, that's sort of the horizontal part, and the feeling good, that's sort of the emphasis on let's do this together. Vertical collectivism would be, you know, it's important for me to respect the decisions made by my group. So there, it's sort of it's not so much about your peers, it's more about showing respect to the leaders in the group and things like that. Horizontal individualism is, you know, I rely on myself most of the time, I rarely rely on others. And vertical individualism, then, one of the questions would be, you know, to what extent do you believe that competition is the law of nature? And so rather than sort of respecting your leaders, you know, you're sort of competing with them and you just assume take their job and so on. At any rate, so what I did for this research was I took Channing Jaskow's 27 scale for measuring motivation to lead, so they had their scale. And then I took Triandis and Gelfin's 16-item scale for measuring individualism and collectivism. And of course, I had all the mandatory demographics. I mean, most importantly, you know, I asked, what's your occupation? Like, are you an engineer or, you know, whatever. And I also, very important to this one, the demographics included, you know, are you European American? Are you Asian American? Are you, you know, other? At any rate, so what happened was I ended up with 152 samples, which is a little on the small side. And they came from 3 sources. So I had 91 of them was surveys I completed at a medical device company in Southern California. Gee, I wonder what company that was. 30 papers were from, I spoke at a conference up in Anaheim, medical device themed conference, and I asked people to fill out the surveys. And then I also had some where I did it via SurveyMonkey, and I sent out emails to former coworkers and so on and asked them to fill it out. All right, so in terms of testing my hypothesis, let's talk about that for a second. So this will be, you know, if you've done a lot of this kind of stuff, this is totally a review. But in case you're not, let me just tell you what the deal is. There's 2 ways you can run into trouble when you're doing hypothesis testing. So they're typically called type 1 and type 2 error. The idea of a type 1 error is false detection, and so what this is the probability that even though your data shows that there's, say, a difference in the mean, that no, it was just because of noise. And then the other side of that, type 2, failed to detect, so that would be a case where maybe your data, the means looked the same, but actually that was, again, because of noise. What the generally accepted in the world of behavioral sciences, which is the world in which I did my PhD, you know, it's all when you're doing people-y stuff like this, the generally accepted criteria is, you know, the probability of type 1 alpha, you want to have that less than 0.05. You want beta to be less than 0.2. And people usually talk about power. Power is 1 minus beta, so you want a power greater than 80. And if you're wondering how I calculated power, there's a real famous statistician named Cohen, and he's got this approach that calls his delta approach. And what you do is you first calculate the effect size, and which is you take the difference of the 2 means, divide it by the standard deviation. Then you calculate Cohen's delta, which is the effect size times the square root of n over 2. He's got a table you look up and boom, there's your power. Now, in terms of results then, what I did is one thing I did is I asked the question, you know, is there a difference between the 2 types of collectivism and 2 types of individualism between Asian American engineers and European American engineers? And if you look at the data here, what you see here for vertical collectivism, what I saw a t-score, the degrees of freedom there is 75. So there was only 75 people in that particular comparison because although I had more people, it turned out a lot of people who took this also were non-engineers. So for this test, I'm only looking at engineers. And we actually did get significance of 0.04, so that meets the 1 criteria. Our power here, even though it's a small sample, is very good at 0.96. So this is a case where we can reject the null hypothesis, which is the highfalutin way of saying, okay, hypothesis confirmed. In our sample, we did see a difference in vertical collectivism between Asian American engineers and European American engineers. For the other ones, we didn't see a difference. And that's a little bit surprising and probably reflects this blending of, people being second, third, and even if they're first generation Asian American engineer, just the fact that they live here now and they've started to adopt the culture where, if it was Asians living in Asia versus Americans living in America, you would absolutely see differences here. So that's interesting. All right, so when we compare Asian American engineers versus European American engineers, and we look at motivation to lead, when we look at the affective identity, we see, actually we don't know what we see, because at first you can look and say, oh, okay, well the significance is 0.25, it's not less than 0.05, so that we don't see a difference, and it's tempting to say, well, okay, so we have shown that there's not a difference. Well, no, we haven't, because the power needs to be at least 0.8. I mean, this power is so low, the significance is high. The bottom line is it's not that we showed this or showed that it's false. There is just simply no data here. There's no signal. The sample's too small. We got nothing on affective identity. When you look at the non-calculative, it's pretty much the same story. There is just simply no signal. But here's the big news. When you look at social normative, we get a signal. Okay, we see that we're greater than 0.05, and what we see is that the power is also 0.8. Bottom line is we accept the null hypothesis. So there is data here, there is signal, and what this shows is there is not a difference between the social normative motivation to lead between Asian Americans and European Americans. Okay, so that's actually big news. The people who say, Asian American engineers don't like to lead, well, at least for this one, the one we have data on, that is false. Okay, so, all right, well, now here's where it gets interesting. Now let's look at engineers versus non-engineers. So when you compare engineers and non-engineers, what you find is in terms of your affective identity, what we see is we do have enough signal to say there is no difference between affective identity motivationally between the two groups. But look at social normative. There absolutely is a difference. That alpha is 0.023, it's below 0.05. The power is very nice, it's 0.95. There is a difference. Okay, what does that mean? So there's no difference between Asian American engineers and European American engineers. We saw that. We saw no evidence of that. But we did see a difference between engineers and non-engineers. And I think that's probably what's going on here. Is I think this is a perception problem. And at the end of the day, prejudice is that, right? It's a perception problem. But I think what happens is, when an Asian American engineer turns down a promotion, I think managers may be misattributing that to the fact that he or she is Asian rather than he or she is an engineer. So you have engineer Bob, who's Asian American. You say, hey, Bob, we'd like to promote you. And Bob says, no, thanks. And the manager says, he said no because he's Asian. That's false. He said no because he's an engineer. See what I'm saying? So that's an important conclusion, that as engineering managers, we need to guard against that. It is not a given that engineers want to be managers, and it has, at least from this data, nothing to do with the fact whether they're Asian or European or whatever. The issue is they're an engineer. All right. Now, for the next conclusion, what do we got here? So we did see a significant difference between the vertical collectivism of Asian American engineers and European American engineers. but we did not, and we did not see a difference between the social normative. So this is very confusing. You know, social normative motivation to lead is the logical place for vertical collectivism to show itself. So I wonder, you know, maybe this is evidence of second generation blending of a culture. The bottom line is I have no real, you know, it's not like a strong conclusion. It's like, okay, this is an interesting thing that needs further study, really is my conclusion there. But it may be just the beginning of saying, okay, we got to start trying to understand how that works with second and third generations. And conclusion number 3, it's kind of in the category of shameless plug. There is a lot more study to do here. We need a larger sample size. And, you know, here's the thing is what I need access to is more data. And so if you work at maybe, you know, I'm particularly interested in medical device manufacturers, but really any engineering firm in North America. You know, if you're interested in working together and you've maybe got a big company and you want to collaborate, and you know, we can if we can get data from 500 engineers or something, we can really make some headway on this. So I'd be open to collaborating on this particular topic. I'm also particularly generally interested in leading engineers, organizational culture, error management culture, leadership and human emotion. Those two were a big part of my dissertation. And then, of course, motivation to lead and societal culture. And then, of course, at the end here, I also have the mandatory references and whatnot. All right, so recapping, what it is I think we have to bear in mind that when we see an Asian American engineer decline in promotion to management, it isn't because they're Asian, it's because they're an engineer. All right, well, thanks for listening. I'm Tom Ulrich, and Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering, and we will talk to you next time.